most distinguished historians of modern India. A former professor of modern Indian history at School of Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and former Dean of the School of Social Sciences, Professor Mukherjee has made seminal contributions to our understanding of the Indian national movement, economic nationalism, and the structural impact of colonialism on India. He is also a member of the Indian Council for Historical Research. His intellectual engagement with Jawaharlal Nehru's ideas has been particularly profound. Through his writings and lectures, Professor Mukherjee has given us a more vivid understanding of Nehru as not merely the first Prime Minister of independent India, but also a visionary who conceptualized the modern Indian state on the foundations of democracy, secularism, scientific temper, and economic planning. His analysis situates Nehru's legacy within the broader anti-colonial struggle and the project of nation building. At a time when debates surrounding the nature of the state, the meaning of secularism, and the resilience of democratic institutions are both urgent and complex, Professor Mukherjee's scholarship offers historical depth, analytical clarity, and intellectual balance. His work reminds us that the Nehruvian vision was not simply a political program, but a carefully articulated framework for safeguarding pluralism, social justice, and constitutional values. Professor Mukherjee has written extensively on Nehru's role in shaping India's economic vision, secular framework, and democratic institutions. He is also associated with works such as Jawaharlal Nehru and the Indian National Movement, essays and lectures on Nehru's economic strategy, planning and secular nationalism, and contributions discussing Nehru as architect of modern India. He is the author of Nehru's India, Past, Present and Future, considered as the most definitive book on Jawaharlal Nehru. Apart from works on Nehru, he has also authored, to name a few, Imperialism, Nationalism and the Making of the Indian Capital Class, Political Economy of Colonial and Post-Colonial India, and he has co-authored with his wife, Dr. Mridula Mukherjee, 3 best-selling titles: India Since Independence, India's Struggle for Independence, and RSS, School Texts, and The Murder of Mahatma Gandhi, The Hindu Communal Project. Dr. Aditya Mukherjee was elected the General President of the Indian History Congress during the year 2023-24 and was visiting professor and fellow at premier institutions like Duke University, USA, University of Tokyo, City of Rome, University of Rome, Institutes of Advanced Study at Nantes, France, Lancaster, UK, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. On behalf of all present here, may I invite Dr. Aditya Mukherjee to kindly deliver the keynote address. We are all ears, sir. Thank you.
To my eternal regret, I do not know Malayalam and therefore could not follow what was evidently a brilliant lecture by Shri Padmanabhan. From whatever little I could get of it, much of what I am going to say is going to be on similar lines. I am very grateful to the principal of the college, Shri M.V. Johnny. I am grateful to the Mr. Raghavan, the MP who invited me initially, to Dr. Shailendra, to Alias Kutti, to all the organizers of this event. And before I start, I must make my customary statement that a visit to Kerala, which I never refuse, is like a whiff of fresh air, clean air, and a clean, free political atmosphere. I come from the world's most environmentally polluted city, New Delhi, where you choke if you walk on the streets, and also at the moment, unfortunately, one of the most undemocratic spaces that you can imagine. So Kerala, therefore, coming here, as I said, is a breath of fresh air. But I also must add that the use that you make of the democratic space that you have in Kerala, mind you, it would take a great amount of courage to organize an event like this on with the name of Jawaharlal Nehru and on secularism, democracy, and the constitution and the Indian state. It would take a lot of courage. So I congratulate the organizers for this, because you may not believe it, but in most parts of the country you cannot do it. I have been invited to, in the national capital, in a central university, to give a talk on Nehru and the making of modern India. And the day before, I get a phone call saying, sir, it is not possible, this has happened, that had happened. Can you drop the name of Nehru? And this has happened not only in Delhi, it has happened in Tamil Nadu, it has happened in large parts of India. So the point I'm making is that you have a democratic space. If we do not occupy that space and expand it, the chances of its closing down are very heavy. I would not, towards the end of my talk, you will see why I'm saying this, that we cannot be sanguine about the freedoms that we have. We need to fight for them to maintain them. Jawaharlal Nehru, as you know, is demonized today. Every possible problem that India has, whether it is poverty, lack of primary education, backwardness in agriculture, the China problem, the Kashmir problem, every pothole in the country is now blamed on Jawaharlal Nehru. The latest is, and this comes from the top of the political order, the latest is to blame Jawaharlal Nehru for the partition of the country. This is the RSS chief who has recently made the statement in newspapers. The Prime Minister wants to commemorate the Partition Horrors Day one day before independence. It is not independence, but it is the partition horrors that you want to remember so that you can polarize society. And the NCERT has produced a text in which they say the chief culprits for the partition of the country, believe you me, are not the British. That's what we thought, that they created the divided rule. They give a clean sheet to the British. This is a text, a module produced by the National Council of Educational Research and Training for the Children of India, which says the British wanted to leave behind a united India. The people who are responsible are Gandhiji and Nehru and Jinnah. No mention, of course, of Savarkar, the first person to talk of Hindus and Muslims constituting two antagonistic nations. He said this in a presidential address in 1938 in the Hindu Mahasabha. And the latest, of course, is Nehru is even, because vote chori has become a common phrase. So Nehru is now being accused of even vote chori. He is supposed to have stolen the votes away from Patel to become the first Prime Minister of the country. So, as I said, the demonization goes very deep. There is a very well-funded website called Dismantling of Nehru, the last Viceroy of India. So he's called essentially a continuation of the British, and this is a hugely funded website, which if you see it, you will be shocked, how much effort has gone into creating this detailed website to demonize one person. There is an ICHR poster. ICHR is supposed to look after the historical research in the country. A poster was created to commemorate 75 years of independence. And there are pictures of Gandhiji, Patel, etc. Nehru is missing. The person who was there, the first Prime Minister for 17 years, is missing. The person who fought for 30 years against the British, 10 of those years in jail, is missing. And in his place is Savarkar, the person who once in jail begged for mercy number of times, and once he was let off, he joined hands with the British. In fact, to oppose the national movement. During the Quit India movement, the Hindu Mahasabha actually offered cooperation to the British so that the Congress could be put down. And they are now being celebrated. So the point I'm making is, it is not only demonizing of Nehru or of Gandhiji, celebrating of Godse. People can actually say that Godse was a freedom fighter and continue to be MPs in the BJP regime. It's not only that, it's an effort to demonize the entire national movement. We must understand this, that they have to do it, because they now claim to be the nationalist. We are the Deshdrohis. Dr. Padmanabhan is the Deshdrohi according to them. They are the nationalists. Now, if they are the nationalists, then the actual national movement has to be discredited. It has to be denied. And it is denied in multiple ways. I'll give you so many examples. The starlet, the younger people here, I'm glad to see there are young people. Kangana Rao, you must have heard of her. She made this statement saying India got its independence only in 2014. And if you thought that that was absurd, the Sarsang Chalak of the RSS said that we got real independence only in 2024. With the consecration of the Ram temple, which was built, as you know, by criminally destroying, this is not my words, this is the Supreme Court's word, destroying the Babri Masjid. That is supposed to be our independence. And when somebody asked Kangana Rao, so what happened in 1947? She said, wo to bheek mein mili thi. It was an arms given to the bigger. That was not real independence. In other words, with one sweep, from Gandhiji, Sardar Patel, Jawaharlal Nehru, Bhagat Singh, Subhash Bose, and here, EMS Namudripad, Keralian, Kelappan, Abdur Rahman, they all become beggars. The idea is to, as I said, erase the actual national movement so that they, the false gods, can now claim to be the nationalist. The reason, as I said, why the Nehru and the national movement is demonized is, as I said, quote unquote, the Hindu nationalists want to be the nationalists. It's a contradiction in terms. How can you talk of Hindu nationalism in a multicultural country? In the entire colonial period, nobody ever used that term. The term used for them was communalist. It's a European academic, Christopher Jeffrelot, who was a very good academic, very critical of Modi and BJP regime, but because they don't understand the word communalism, has started using the phrase Hindu nationalism. And it has been now picked up, and everybody, including secular people, are calling them Hindu nationalists. Jawaharlal Nehru in the 30s says that this is ridiculous. How can you even dream of adding nationalism to their names? Because they are anti-national, they are regressive, they are destructive of the country. So we must be very careful when we use this phrase. The second reason why they demonize Nehru and the national movement is because they do not agree with any of the core values of the national movement. The core values which Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. And many elements of that idea of India was discussed by Dr. Padmanabhan. But let me very quickly, in 5 minutes, summarize this for you. What are the core values on which, and I emphasize on which, there was a consensus across the entire spectrum of the national movement. The Indian national movement was not a narrow national movement. It had the left, the communists, the socialists, the Gandhians, the Nehruites, the liberals, even the capitalists. So it was a very wide movement. It had the revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh. But all of them, they may have many differences, but on certain basic issues, 5 basic principles which we call the idea of India, there was a consensus. The only people who did not agree with it were the loyalists and the communalists. So what were these basic ideas? Very quickly. First, sovereignty. India will be independent and it will be anti-imperialist. Which means that not only will India be independent, it will support anti-imperialism globally. The idea that the Indian state will actually join hands with Israel for the massacre of the Gazan people was inconceivable. We are now a much richer, more powerful country, but even in the 1950s, immediately after independence, India stood up on every issue of imperial domination globally, whether it be Vietnam, whether it be Belgian Congo, whether it be Korea, wherever. And when people said, who are you? You go around with a begging bowl and you are advising the world on how to progress. So Nehru's famous words were, we may be poor, but who has told you that the poor cannot have a voice? In other words, even when we were poor, we had a voice. Now that we are not quote unquote so poor, though that is questionable, we have succumbed to the dominant voice in the world. So the first issue was sovereignty. The second was democracy. I want to emphasize this. Right from the conception of the Indian national movement, democracy was a central idea. As early as the 1890s, Bal Gangadhar Tilak is talking of adult franchise. That is, every citizen, irrespective of caste, color, region, language, ethnicity, gender, would have an equal vote. 1890s. Decades before anywhere in the world do you have a democracy. Decades before in Europe, they are still fighting for women's right to vote. In the 1960s, in the United States, you are still fighting civil rights to decide whether a black can sit next to you, leave alone vote. So in other words, the idea of democracy is very deep down and very old in India. Third was secularism. And secularism and democracy were two terms which were conjoined. If you look at the literature in the 1920s, 30s, you will find the term used is secular democracy. Together. Just as communalism was bracketed with loyalism, because all communal parties, whether it be the Muslim League or Hindu Mahasabha or whatever, were all loyalist, right? So secularism and democracy were conjoined because you cannot be a democracy if you are not secular. You cannot say, I am secular, but my secularism only for the Hindus, the Christians and the Muslims can take a walk. No, that's not secularism. I take a slight aside here. We at the moment have our leaders wanting us to be proud about ridiculous stuff that, we could fly planes in ancient India. We had plastic surgery and, Hanuman went to the moon and stuff like that. We need not do that. We can be proud of something legitimate and real. For example, the way India imagined itself as a nation is unique in world history. Nation states emerge in the world only in the 18th and 19th centuries, modern nation states. Before that, there were empires. This idea of ancient nations is ridiculous. There were no nations in ancient and the medieval period. There were empires. The size of the empire would vary. There's the Mauryan Empire, the Mughal Empire, there is the Chola Empire, etc., etc. They were not nation states. Europe was divided, for example, between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Nation states emerge in the modern period out of them. France, England, Italy, etc. recent phenomenon. And they emerge on the principle of one language, one religion. Catholic France, not even Christian France, Catholic France. Protestant England. Unification of Germany as a country on the basis of language. Unification of Italy on the basis of one language. At that time, for India to imagine a nation which will celebrate diversity was unique in the world and revolutionary. And we must understand that our nationalism is not the same as European nationalism. It is the contrast of European nationalism. Nationalism emerges in the world simultaneously with imperialism. As the modern nation states came up, France, England, Italy, Germany, they simultaneously acquired colonies. So their nationalism was a dominating, aggressive nationalism. Our nationalism was anti-imperialist, it was humane, it was liberating. One difference. Theirs was monolithic, homogeneous. Ours celebrated diversity. That is why when our national movement started, the British said, how can you even be a nation? You are demanding a national rights, etc. You cannot be a nation. You are only the phrase they used was, you are only a geographical expression. You cannot be a nation. Why? Because with hundreds of languages and religions and etc., how can you be a nation? So we must accept that the notion of our being an inclusive secular democracy as a nation was a unique idea. There was no notion of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan was a slogan which would have been laughed out of the window. We would not have been a nation at all if we ever started with that slogan. But believe you me, this is the slogan today. One language, one religion, and now increasingly one leader. This is not our nationalism. What I want to say is that a foreign idea of a nation is being imposed on us today in the name of nationalism while rejecting what is actually our nationalism. The fourth element of the idea of India was a pro-poor orientation. I use my words carefully. I'm not saying socialist or communist. Pro-poor. On that there was a consensus. From the early 19th century, from the what we call the moderates, Dadabhai Naoroji's first book is Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. You read R. Siddharth, Dadabhai Naoroji, Tilak, any one of them, Surendranath Banerjee, you'll find that they are all talking of the reason we need to overthrow imperialism is because it causes poverty, right? So from that to Gandhiji talking of turning the face towards the poor, the Daridra Narayan, to the socialists and the communists, to Bhagat Singh and the revolutionaries, there was a consensus on pro-poor. And lastly, number 5. I mentioned these 5 because all these 5 are being challenged today. The 5th one was a scientific temper. That modern India, that independent India, will not be based on obscurantism, on superstition, but on the basis of a modern scientific temper. All 5 of these values, in these words, are in the Constitution of India, including the scientific temper is an article of the Constitution of India. The Constitution of India, in other words, is the distillation of our freedom struggle. And those who deny our freedom struggle, naturally, therefore, also now question our constitution. The reason why Gandhiji chose Jawaharlal Nehru as his successor, because he believed, and we now know historically correctly, that not only was Nehru the best fighter of these values in India, but he was most capable of implementing them after independence. In fact, in 1942, while speaking to the AICC, Gandhiji said the following. You know, these days it's very popular to pit one nationalist leader against the other. Gandhi versus Patel, Patel versus Nehru, Bose versus Nehru. You know, if you believe the current discourse, you would think that the national movement was all about fighting each other, not fighting the British, right? So the Gandhiji was aware of this. He says, people say Jawaharlal and I are estranged. This is baseless. And then Gandhiji was, as was his capacity, using always very expressive imagery. He says, you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. Similarly, he said, you cannot divide Nehru and me. This is when Nehru is openly criticizing views about Gandhiji. His autobiography that Shri Padmanabhan mentioned is a critique of Gandhiji. But current people don't even begin to understand that great people can have differences and yet be able to fight for a common cause. You know, these are not petty differences. They are arguing about large issues, right? So Gandhiji says, you cannot divide us like you cannot divide water by just trying to break it with a stick. And then he said, by name, not Rajaji, not Sardar Bhai Patel, 2 of his most brilliant and most loyal followers. He says, but Jawahar will be my successor. When I am gone, he will speak my language too. And as it happened, the Mahatma was murdered, as you know, a few months after independence, and Sardar Patel died in 1950. So the burden of really carrying forward the idea of India fell on the shoulders of Jawaharlal Nehru to a great extent. It was a Herculean effort. And he took this on with an elan that we can be really proud of. You know, when people these days criticize Jawaharlal Nehru, I mean, then there are so many of them. Lord Meghnad Desai, fortunately his lordship was Lord in England and not in India. Lord Meghnad Desai, then Panagarya, the Columbia professor who was advisor to Modi in economic affairs, they all, you know, are very dismissive of the Nehru period. Meghnad Desai said that the first 40 years of India's independence were wasted years. What they miss is among many things. I'll just mention a few. The first thing they miss is what economists call the initial conditions. When you compare something, you have to see where are you starting from. You cannot compare somebody who's starting from 300 meters behind you and then say, look, he lost the race. Because he's already starting 300 meters behind you. Where did Nehru start from? Nehru started from what Rabindranath Tagore, again in his inimitable language, described. He said that the British will one day have to leave India. But when they leave India, what mud and filth will they leave behind? And what is the mud and filth they left behind? These people, Panagriya, Thankar Roy, and etc., they said that British rule was good for India. You know, we became the 9th industrial country, this, that, and the other. We got railways, this, that. And the filth left behind was the following. Just to remind ourselves, at independence in 1950, for example, the average life expectancy, that is the number of years a person was likely to live, was less than 30. On an average, Indians died in their 20s, average, which means the poor must have died when they were 5, 6, 8, 9, or even childbirth. So that is what you're starting from. 94% of women were illiterate, 84% of all Indians were illiterate. 3 years before independence, 3 million people die of hunger, the Bengal famine. And most of all, the British left a deeply divided country. 5 lakh killed, 50 to 60 lakh refugees. That is what is inherited. A deeply divided country, poor, uneducated nation on which he has to build a modern, secular, democratic country. So at least one must remember that. The first big challenge to the idea of India comes at the birth of the nation itself. If the idea of India is secular, democratic, pro-poor, etc., then the first challenge comes at independence itself. If you look at the period 1946 to 48, we describe it like, it is like a Holocaust-like situation. Holocaust is what happened in Europe under fascism, the period when Hitler kills 6 million Jews, etc. We had a Holocaust-like situation. 1946, the Calcutta killings occur, retaliatory killings in Bihar, retaliatory killings in Bengal, and then the partition of the country, killings in Punjab, Delhi, etc. And I said 60 lakhs refugees, 5 to 6 lakhs people killed. And on top of that, in January 1948, the Mahatma is murdered. And Nehru again, one of the, again, Dr. Padmanabhan mentioned it, that Nehru wrote all these volumes. Professor Irfan Habib says that if you look at the prison writings of Jawaharlal Nehru, they are as important in size and in depth as the writings of Antonio Gramsci in prison writings. You know, one of the world's greatest thinkers, right? So there's no doubt. These days we take it for granted that your Prime Minister was highly educated, you know, who could write a book in jail. The manuscript of Discovery of India lies in the Nehru Memorial Museum. It's handwritten. And you will find that he's written the whole book with hardly any corrections. You know, it takes an enormous power of the mind. You know, those were not days where your Prime Ministers had a degree which was not found, or had a degree on a subject which is not known. I hope you are aware. The subject on which our Prime Minister is supposed to have a degree, which degree hasn't been found yet, is supposed to be entire political science. Have you ever heard of a subject called entire political science? So imaginary subject, imaginary degree. But we are talking of a different time when we had outstanding intellectuals. And Nehru was therefore able to see what was the reason behind Gandhiji's murder. He says, and later research has proven all that he said, that it was not only Gandhi. Beginning with Gandhi, the idea was to murder a set of people and create a situation of chaos so that that chaos could be used to, his words again, to do a coup and change the nature of the state. The nature of a state is always the product of the movement that created the state. The movement was a was a movement on the basis of idea of India, democratic, secular, etc. So that was going to be the state. Now they wanted to use the enormous communal temperature because of the partition and the killings and the murder of Mahatma, etc., to use the situation to now create a Hindu Rashtra. They thought this was the best opportunity now to do a Hindu Rashtra, which Sardar Patel said would be a catastrophe. So did Ambedkar, and Gandhiji, of course, said that this was absurd. India belongs to everybody, he said, every religion, and he mentioned them by name. The smallest, Deni Israelis, Christians, Indian Christians, Muslims, he said it belongs to anybody who lives here. India is not a Hindu Rashtra. He said it as early as 1942 in his famous speech. That is not the future we are looking at. All right? But they wanted to use the situation at independence to create a Hindu Rashtra. And the reason, I want to take 4 or 5 minutes on this, because from this, what happened in this period, we can draw some lessons for what we can do now. If from a situation, because now things look very, very bad indeed, not probably in Kannur, but in most other parts of the country, things look indeed very bad. It doesn't look bad to some Christians here who are playing ball with BJP, but it looks very bad to the Christian priest in Bihar and Orissa, whose mouth is filled with cow dung, and is paraded naked on the streets. So it is, and these things are happening in our country, right? So we mustn't forget about that aspect of it. So what did they do? When this riot situation is occurring, what is the tallest leader of the country? What is Mahatma Gandhi doing? 1946, November 1946, Noakhali riots are occurring and Gandhiji goes to Noakhali. Noakhali, most people don't even know where it is. It's a remote corner of what is now Bangladesh. So he goes there and he walks from one village to another every night. He doesn't sleep in any village, trying to spread peace. The leaders of the national movement are saying, Mahatma Ji, the greatest event of the 20th century is about to happen. That is the transfer of our power to India. Why do I call it the greatest event? With the British losing the Indian Empire, the colonial system of that kind got wiped out entirely, the world over, one after the other. China followed, then one nation after Africa. The colonial setup of that kind got destroyed. So this was a huge event. And the architect of that event is not there when the transfer of power is being discussed. So the leaders went to Gandhiji in Barisal and said, not Barisal, Noakhali, and said, Gandhiji, how long will you be here? He said, as long as it takes. And you know how long he was there? 4 months. November 46 to February 47, he is walking the streets of Noakhali. He says, what use is this independence if the soul of India has been destroyed? For him, the soul of India was, as you know, the Hindu-Muslim unity. The reason why he was called a one-man boundary force, that on the day of independence, 1947, 15th August, the Muslims in Calcutta were very afraid that there will be now a revenge of the Calcutta killings of 1946 and there will be a massacre on the Muslims. So Suravardi goes to Gandhiji and says, Gandhiji, you have to protect the minorities. Gandhiji said, yes, provided you walk with me on the streets. So together they walked hand in hand through the streets of Calcutta. Not one man was killed. That is when Mountbatten said, Mahatma Gandhi, you are a one-man boundary force. With all our army and police, we cannot stop the massacres in Punjab. And in Bengal, you stopped it. This one man has stopped it. So this is Gandhiji, but then they murdered him. What did Nehru do? The retaliatory killings that happened in Noakhali was happening in Bihar, where Muslims were killed on a massive scale. Nehru landed up, this is the interim government, 46 period, he landed up with his entire cabinet. Sardar Patel, Kripalani, everybody, Jayaprakash Narayan, everybody, whole lot. And he said, we will land in Bihar and we'll stay there till the riots are contained. Why am I mentioning this? Today, 40 miles from Delhi, a soldier's son can be lynched because of the suspicion of what meat he may be having in his fridge. I'm talking of akhlaq. 40 miles from Delhi. Where is our political leadership? Why is the whole country not sitting there and saying, this is not on? But I just wanted to give you a contrast of what was done. But the most important thing that was done, for which the BJP cannot forgive Nehru, you must understand, why do they concentrate on Nehru? Because he took away the low-hanging fruit. It seemed to them in 1947-48 that now is the time to create a Hindu Rashtra, because the Hindus are aroused, there is a Hindu-Muslim conflict, etc. Nehru converted the first election into a virtual referendum. He traveled about 40,000 miles and he had no 8,000 crore rupee plane, as you can imagine. He used every mode of transport, traveled all over the country, spoke directly as I am speaking to each other, to 1 out of 10 persons in India at that time. And he wasn't alone. Nehru, I'm just using as a shortcut. The product of our national movement went around the country, and the issue was single. Do we want a secular India in our first general election, or do we want the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan? Do we want a Hindu Rashtra as opposed to the Muslim Pakistan, or do we want a secular India? 94% of the Indian people voted for a secular India. That is the victory of the national movement. The Hindu Mahasabha, Ram Rajya Parishad, etc., put together got only 6% of the votes, despite the raised communal temperature. Now this is what they thought was Nehru's greatest crime. He took away from them what was a low-hanging fruit, and apart from that, he also put them all in jail. Nearly 25,000 RSS people were put in jail after Gandhiji's murder, and do not blame Nehru again. Home Minister was Sardar Patel. It is Sardar Patel who was a criminal lawyer, had actually studied Gandhi's murder case, and he has written, I'm quoting him in word by word, that after examining the case, I have no doubt in my mind that it is an extreme wing of the Hindu Mahasabha led by Savarkar, which planned the conspiracy and saw it through. This is Sardar Patel. You can build long statues about him, but you cannot take away the fact that he was a follower of Gandhi and that he was deeply secular. And he put all these guys in jail. Now, some quick points. While it is true that in the first election, the communalists were pushed to a corner, Mahatma Gandhi, by his death, achieved an enormous thing. All the people who were even halfway inclined towards Hindu communalism, it was like there was a cathartic effect on them. They were deeply ashamed of themselves. The Hindu communalists hid behind the woodwork. They have now emerged and say, "Garv se kaho hum Hindu hai," but mind you, in the 50s and 60s, they would not be seen, let alone appreciated in decent company. So they had been pushed back. But they were not extinguished. And we did not do certain things that Nehru had suggested, and we are paying the price today. They are sitting on our heads. And we have to have a second freedom struggle to save our democracy and our secular country. What did Nehru say? Firstly, this is all available now. I want to tell everybody that with great effort, we have been able to digitize everything that Nehru spoke, wrote, etc. The 100 volumes of his selected works, all of it is digitized in nehruarchive.org. You can open it on your phone, you can search it, you put in one subject, and out of the 100 volumes, wherever any reference to that subject comes, will be in front of you. It has been an amazing breakthrough for young researchers who do not have the time, like poor old people like us who would sit through the archives over years and years and years and discover things. It's very quick. So he said, he reminded of a few things. I want to quickly go over it. Communalism is the main threat, so maximum time there. He says, number one, he recognized the fascist nature of communalism in the 1930s. It is in 1990 that Amartya Sen coins the phrase communal fascism. But Nehru is saying from the 30s. Both the Muslim League and the RSS, he's saying they have fascist characteristics. And now we know the leaders of the Hindu Mahasabha, for example, visited Mussolini, met him, learned the tricks that they had and tried to imitate it for the RSS. And the leaders of the RSS, Golwalkar included, actually praised Hitler, Savarkar and Golwalkar, saying that, look, this is how national pride should be. Look at the racial pride that Hitler has created and see what he does to the Jews. In other words, that's what we should do to our minorities. But Nehru was warning from 1947, letters to the Chief Minister. He's saying we may have defeated them in the election, but do not forget they are fascists and they will regroup. And unless we eliminate this pestilence, we are not safe in this country. We did not take it seriously. Second thing he said, the result after the victory of the 1951 election, what lesson have I learned, he said. The lesson I have learned is that if you remain fast to your secular position, if you do not compromise with communalism, which many of my friends were saying you must, otherwise you lose the Hindu vote or this vote or that vote. He said, if you do not compromise, you win. If you compromise, you lose. This lesson we did not learn. So one secular party after the other, to beat the other secular party, joined hand with the communalists. We did it in the 60s in the states. We did it at the national level in 1977. The Janata Party actually allowed the RSS to merge in itself, gave them credibility at the national level for the first time. The untouchables of the 50s and 60s are now in national level. Jai Prakash Narayan famously said, when he was criticized, after all, he was a great socialist, that what are you doing with these RSS fellows? He says, they are fascist. He said, if RSS is fascist, I am fascist. Gave them a certificate. Nehru was saying, don't touch them, don't compromise. We did it again in 1989, saying Congress is more dangerous than the BJP. And a large section of communal parties, including the left, joined hands to overthrow the Congress. BJP came up from 2 to 80 seats, and the rest is history. It is now recognized. The Congress president, the current president, Khadge, made a famous statement. He said, you cannot lick poison. Ki jara chaat ke dekh lete hain. You know, if you lick poison, you're dead. This is what Nehru was saying. Do not compromise. Don't say, I'll compromise a little bit. If you compromise with communalism, it's communalists who are the victors. Those Christian groups who are trying to compromise with the BJP today do not see the writing on the wall. They will be wiped out. This is what Nehru was trying to say, and this lesson we have not at all learned. Nehru also said, use state power and an ideological offensive to defeat communalism. We did neither. State power was not used. 2002, the Gujarat massacre occurs, right? Everybody knows that what communalism can do. Thousands of people are massacred. 2002. 2004, a secular state comes to power. 2004 to 2014, 10 years you have a secular state. But you must have seen the film, the younger ones, nobody killed Jessica. So, nobody destroyed the mosque. Nobody did the Gujarat massacre. Nothing. Nobody is behind bars. In other words, you did not use state power. Neither did you use an ideological offensive. We are still not using an ideological offensive. In the states like Kerala, which is ruled by the LDF or the UDF, or Bengal, which for decades were ruled by the left, where is the ideological offensive against the RSS? Zero. When the RSS was put in jail in 1948, they were released on the condition that they will not do any politics. What did they do? They started their first Saraswati Shishu Mandir, a school. with Golwalkar's presence in 1951. Today, they are in 90% of the districts of India. Just Google and see. 90% of the districts of India, there are RSS schools. Where are our schools? Where is our counter-ideological offensive? Zero. So neither state power nor an ideological offensive in a serious way is happening. Two minutes, if I have your permission, on the other aspects of the idea of India. Democracy. Nehru said, democracy is non-negotiable. Won't give it up for anything. And democracy was defined by his Guru Gandhiji, and Nehru fully accepted, as full freedom for civil liberties. Free press, total civil liberties. And Gandhiji, again, if I may give you another of his beautiful phrases, how he expresses an idea. When he said, what do you mean by full freedom of press? He says, civil liberties and freedom of press is like the water of life. Without water, there is no life. And he said, have you ever heard of anybody diluting water? In other words, it cannot be diluted. It must be complete. And then he gives examples. He says, freedom of the press doesn't mean that you only praise me. Freedom of the press, he says, means that you can say the harshest criticism of me. That is what the freedom of the press is. And Gandhiji also, and by the way, all of this is included in the Karachi Resolution of 1931 and in the Constitution. Second thing, what democracy is, freedom of association. What we are doing today. This freedom does not exist in India anymore. You cannot hold a meeting in Delhi. Even in Harkishan Singh Surjit Bhavan, which is the CPM's office, and their own building with a hall, they could not hold a meeting during G20, which was critical of our government's position. The police came and disrupted it. There were members of parliament, there were former cabinet ministers sitting in that. They said, you can't hold it. JNU, where I've taught for 45 years, when I have to give a speech like this, no room will be given to us. So we speak in the parking lot, roughly like it's the situation here. But then you are doing it out of choice. We are doing it out of necessity. Nehru's insistence on democracy meant, again something to be proud of, that ours was the only revolution which was not followed by a civil war. Our national revolution, we should call it a revolution. Just because it was a peaceful transfer doesn't mean it was not a revolution. Thousands of people gave their lives. Just the 42 movement, 10,000 people were killed. So it was a big revolution. Our language is somewhat spoilt by a very orthodox left view of language. It was a great national revolution, one of the biggest in the world. And it was not followed by a civil war. The French Revolution was, the Russian Revolution was, the Chinese Revolution after a few years led to between 20 to 60 million being eliminated. Ours was not. Because Nehru would not push through what his personal belief was. And that is one reason why the left at that time was very critical of Nehru. That why aren't you pushing your radical ideas? You are a socialist, you are a Marxist. Why don't you push through your ideas? You can do it. He said, I will not do it unless I can carry everybody with me. Or an overwhelming majority with me. And that is why we had what is called the Nehruvian consensus. Eventually, there was a consensus from the left to the right to the planning effort that occurred in India. Nehru was, of course, saved the freedom of the press. No question of a cartoonist being put in jail before he cracked a joke, or like the Kerala journalist who's on his way to report something. He hasn't even reported. He wants to look at the rape and murder in Bihar and he's arrested. Now that would be inconceivable in Nehru's time. The parliament was actually the parliament. He respected the opposition. He attended each session of the parliament, even at a late age when he was ill. And most importantly, he never would put away a difficult question. During the China war, the opposition raised question and he requisitioned a special session of parliament to discuss China. Answered each question. Today you cannot even mention China. You cannot mention, as again my previous speaker said, you cannot mention Adani, you cannot mention China, you cannot mention Operation Sindhu, you cannot mention Pakistan. What is the parliament has been reduced to? Not in Nehru's time. The sharpest of criticism. And he would praise the person who criticizes him and say, wow, this is the way you should be. He in fact is famously praised even Atal Bihari Vajpayee, that this young man has this spirit in him of critique. And when not enough criticism of him occurred, Nehru famously wrote articles against himself with a pseudonym, Chanakya. Because he said, what is a democracy if there is no opposition to my views? I quote a very interesting line which he says, in 1950 he said, he's at the peak of his popularity. He said, I want a strong opposition. And then as if he could anticipate the current situation, he said, I do not want in India to be a country in which millions of people say yes to one man. And now what is happening? Opposition Mukt Bharat, Congress Mukt Bharat, Andolan Jivi Mukt. Andolan Jivi are now called Parjivi. Parjivi means parasite. Andolan Jivi means those who do agitation. So these have now become bad words. They are the left liberals, the Lutyens Delhi, etc., the manner Khan Market gang. So all of these, Amnesty International cannot function in India. Human rights organizations cannot function. So anybody who raises question cannot function. So this is a big. And if opposition raises a voice, what is the answer? Modi, Modi, one man. So this is a huge contrast. Let us look back and see what we can draw. Nehru built the institutions of democracy. The judiciary, the bureaucracy, the independence of the judiciary. What a joke we have made of our judiciary. I will come to one of the jokes about our judiciary in a moment. One of the institutions that Nehru wanted to build as an academic who has spent most of my life as a teacher in a university which within a few years became one of the world's best in many disciplines, including mine in history. He said, again in December 47, just after independence, he's building a new India. What university does he want? He says, a university stands for humanism, for tolerance, for reason, for the adventure of ideas and the search for truth. If the university discharges their duty adequately, then all is well with the nation and the people. But, again he's anticipating what is happening today. But he says, if the temple of learning itself becomes a home of narrow bigotry and petty objectives, how then will a nation prosper or a people grow in stature? That is what has happened to our temples of learning. My university is under attack, like most other universities, but they started with the best, because the textbook they're following is that of Hitler. This is what Hitler did to Frankfurt University, which was the most liberal and the best university in Germany. And the manner in which he destroyed it, harass the faculty, arrest students. What I'm describing was written by Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker is one of the world's most well-known management gurus who was teaching in Frankfurt, was then had to leave for the United States. So we are following that in a textbook manner. My own students, Sharjeel Imam and Omar Khalid, are my students. Two of the most brilliant students I have had. Sharjeel Imam is an IIT engineer. After doing his engineering, he comes and wants to do history. These are bright boys. The only crime they committed is A, they are Muslim, which is in today's India a crime in itself. B, they had the courage to do what a citizen of the country is duty bound to do, which is criticize the government. And he did. They criticized the government and they have been arrested. They are in jail, 5 years in jail. The judiciary, the joke about the judiciary, 50 times. 50 times when his bail application came up, Omar Khalid's, the judge was not present. 50 times. So we have made a joke of our judiciary, and we need to go back to our. It is not a surprise, therefore, that the world, we may be calling ourselves Vishwaguru, mother of democracy. You must have heard our Prime Minister from the rooftop declaring we are the mother of democracy. The world doesn't think we are a democracy at all. The three major institutions which study democracy, the VDEM Institute of Sweden, the Freedom House of the United States, and the Economists Intelligence Unit, they study global democracy. They put India in the Freedom of Press Index, 161 out of 180. We are scraping the bottom. The freedom of press in India is less than Russia and Venezuela. And in the democracy index as well, we are very, very low. And we are now described as, the word democracy has been taken away. Earlier they said a weak democracy, a compromised democracy. Now we are described as an electoral autocracy. And we are just one last step, only 10 countries left. We are at the bottom, 10 countries left to go the last step where they become total autocracies. The electoral also goes. In other words, democracy is not just winning an election. Do remember, Trump also won an election, Hitler also won an election. You know, democracy is more than winning an election, is what the world is saying, and they are calling us an electoral autocracy. So how many minutes do I have? If I'm not putting you all to sleep, then I'll take a few more minutes. I want to mention at least briefly 2 or 3 other things about Nehru which are not very well known, and then I will end. I just wanted to mention that at independence, when we say that the core ideas of the idea of India's sovereignty, independence, democracy, etc., secularism, the first question, independence. Were we independent at independence? Nehru said no. He said we are in a neo-colonial situation. We've got political independence, but we are dependent on the same countries from whom we got independence. That's what neo-colonialism is. Why? If a country needs to grow, they have to invest. Right? In order to invest, you need machines. We made no machines. 95% of machine tools in 1950. Machine tool means hand, pliers and wrenches. 95% of even that was imported. We made nothing. So what were we dependent on? The advanced world. 1945 onwards, industrial delegations going from India to Germany, to England, to USA. You know, how can we get machines from you? This is what Nehru transforms. When these fraudulent economists today, you know, whether from Columbia or wherever, say the Nehruvian years were wasted, they don't realize the Nehruvian years were the unstructuring of colonialism. The Nehru-Mahalanobis plan transformed this situation. Let me just give you 2 figures which will astonish you. In 1947, in order to invest anything, 100% of the machinery has to be invested. All right? The Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, heavy industry-based, public sector-based strategy, led to a situation that in 1960, only 43% had to be imported. And by 1974, only 9% had to be imported. Only 9%. This is what is economic sovereignty. No big speeches and calling yourself Vishwagurus make you a big guru. We are in no bargaining position. The reason why India had an independent foreign policy at that time, the reason why Nehru and then following Nehruvian path, Indira Gandhi could lead 100 countries in the world in the non-alignment movement, refused to be part of either of the superpowers, is because of this, because of creating this economic sovereignty. That was Nehru's contribution. That is what we call the unstructuring of colonialism. That is what enabled us to open up in the 1990s. When young people these days say, if only we had the economic reforms in 1950, because after the economic reforms we have higher rates of growth. So they say that if only we did it in 1950, where we would have reached. we would have become a banana republic if we had opened up in the 1950s. Because we had no bargaining position. We would have just allowed foreign capital to take over our country. Nehru prevented that. The Nehruvian years were not wasted years. They were the period on the shoulders of which we have created today's India. And critical in that was again something that people just forget. I think you made a reference to that. Nehru anticipated the knowledge revolution. We missed the first industrial revolution, we missed the second industrial revolution because of being a colonized country. Nehru was not going to let us miss the next revolution, which was the information technology revolution. So if you look at the plans in the 1950s, it is not only the dams and what was called the temples of modern India, the steel mills, the dams, the factories, the fertilizer factories. It was the IITs, the IIMs, the Bhabha Atomic Research Center. By 1957, within 7 years, we had an atomic reactor which was critical, starting from zero. The predecessor of ISRO, the National Physical Laboratory, Chemical Laboratory, any institution that you know of, Sangeet Natak Academy, Bharat Kala Academy, the National Institute of Design, the Film Institute. I said any institution of knowledge that you know of was created in Nehru's time. It is because of that today, you know that more than half our GDP is produced in the service sector. Now, what is the service sector but knowledge? Our balance of payment today is managed largely because we are exporting knowledge. That is the remittances we get by exporting our human knowledge, etc. But I wanted to just flag this, that we forget this aspect of it. Last 2 points. Pro-poor orientation. I think we have given up the task. The biggest pro-poor task that Nehru undertook was the land reforms. It is a complete